everyone, and welcome to our webinar series, Urgent and Emerging Topics in Academic Integrity. My name is Sarah Elaine Eaton. I'm the Educational Leader in Residence for Academic Integrity through the Taylor Institute of Teaching and Learning. I'm also an Associate Professor in the Workland School of Education, where I specialize in higher education, leadership, policy, and governance. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to Dr. Claudius Sedin from the University of Winnipeg. And shortly I'll hand the microphone over to Claudius to do his presentation on But Prof, I don't know what other words to use, academic integrity, challenges and questions for instructors. Before I hand things over to Claudius, I wanted to take a moment to recognize that the Taylor Institute of Teaching and Learning and the University of Calgary are situated on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and that our home, the city of Calgary, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. With that in mind, I'd like to ask you and invite you as participants of today's session to let us know where you're joining us from using the text chat box. And that will take us into our housekeeping to let us know that this session is being recorded. The text chat that you type in will not be captured as part of the recording. And also your participant names will not be recorded. And that we will have the recording posted on the Taylor Institute YouTube channel within a couple of weeks of today's session. And that during the session, in order to ensure a high quality recording, we would request that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the session. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and hand things over to Dr. Claudius Sedin. Claudius, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, and thank you for allowing me to present. So, just before I begin the formal presentation, I was kindly asked by Sarah Eaton to do a presentation on rephrasing apps based on my presentation for the Manitoba Academic Integrity Network. So today I'm not presenting as an expert with years of deep research on the topic. I'm simply an educator who thinks about the teaching and learning environment from multiple perspectives, and who considers integrity to be essential to education and life. However, I did delve into both the phenomenon of rephrasing and some of the many apps available. And as I was preparing this presentation, one of my students admitted to using such an app on an assignment, so this issue is quite live for me. So hopefully our discussion today won't be totally depressing, but help us think about the topic from a variety of perspectives. It is, after all, an initial exploration and discussion of an important topic. So, some research, for example, Wall and company, suggests that use of paraphrasing tools to conceal plagiarism is very common. And this implies some intentionality on the part of the student to make it look like the work they submit is original rather than copied or ghostwritten. And in part, this could be to thwart plagiarism detection software or plagiarism hardware. That's us, we're the hardware. However, this may not be true for everyone who uses such tools. This title captures, I think, the frustration of students and by extension educators, and highlights one reason that rephrasing apps or processes are used. I want to thank Lisa Vogt, a colleague and the academic integrity specialist at Red River College Polytech, Dr. Sarah Eaton from University of Calgary, and Josh Sealand from Assiniboine Community College for their advice and feedback on this presentation. So a little bit about my context. A bit about me. So I'm not an expert in plagiarism, either detecting or committing plagiarism, just to be clear, or on the technical workings of artificial intelligence-based apps. I'm an educator at the University of Winnipeg and the faculty development consultant at Red River College Polytech. The course I teach at the U of W is a degree credit foundational skills course focused on academic success. I have a background in educational technology, media production, and of course in instructional design and educational development. But I'm also a student, so I've also been able to look at the issue from multiple perspectives. Today, we're going to briefly look at some key terms and some rephrasing and paraphrasing tools. I'm also going to bring up some recent examples that reveal my thoughts on how to handle issues related to use of rephrasing tools or processes. And finally, I want to pose some specific and hopefully provocative discussion questions on this topic. So some key terms that need to be briefly defined. Paraphrasing, as most, if not all of us understand, is the expression of an idea using mostly one's own words and sentence structure. In other words, the idea is expressed differently from how the originator did it, and without closely following their words and structures, at least according to Rogerson and McCarthy. And this is a legitimate way for students to demonstrate their understanding of a concept. And it's something that relies on content knowledge and writing experience. Patch writing, on the other hand, is the opposite. It is, as Howard says, copying from a source text and then deleting some words, altering grammatical structures, or plugging in one-for-one synonym substitutes. Even if the text is properly cited, it could still be considered plagiarism, or at least not students' own work. It could be problematic in many cases in terms of original work. So essentially, this is word substitution within the existing sentence and paragraph structure. This is a common error since it is a transitional method and allows content area and writing novice to get something on paper. Rephrasing sounds like a synonym for paraphrasing, and typically it is. However, when coupled with the use of artificial intelligence software, it takes on a different characteristic. Basically, it is software-aided paraphrasing where words and sometimes sentence structures are replaced using artificial intelligence. So in other words, it's not a result of the student's own thinking. The following framework guides my approach to issues of rephrasing and academic misconduct in general. I value learning over punishment, so I'd rather take the time to help students overcome barriers and challenges, not that I won't write up a student for misconduct if warranted. I see integrity as having educational and performative aspects, meaning my course and teaching must have integrity, so be as complete and honest as possible, and students must perform with integrity, meaning they do their own best work. I try to be equitable in my dealings with students, given that not all of them are equally skilled, and this requires me to listen first rather than accuse, based on assumptions or even apparent evidence. And I believe in procedural and substantive fairness when dealing with issues of academic integrity. So this requires that I base my approach on fact instead of conjecture, although intuition is important. Decisions need to balance self-care with student care. Not doing this can be detrimental to all parties. And finally, decisions must be defensible. They should be reasonable and arrived at logically. Part of a well-rounded education is the requirement for students to communicate their knowledge in writing. But what happens when students lack the foundational skills or willingness to write to our standards? So I'm giving you a bit of an overview of a case. It's a bit of a composite case that I've experienced personally. So looking at my students, there are several options for them, ranging from the desirable and acceptable to the outright unethical. One choice then is to use rephrasing software, which automatically replaces words with synonyms, whether they make sense in context or not. Sometimes students do this manually using translation apps or thesauruses. Regardless, the result is a poorly written paper that can be borderline plagiarized. So I'm going to chronicle my response to one situation or one composite situation primarily, but we'll also mention others as relevant. I'll discuss how we can respond educationally and then pose some looming questions. So, rephrasing tools. These are specific apps purpose-built for this activity, and they include Spinbot, Quillbot, WordTune, and many others. Even Grammarly bills itself as a paraphrasing tool, although now they've rephrased it as additional advanced suggestions or tone detection, to quote their website. They also say about themselves, Grammarly's tone detection or detector works by analyzing a combination of signals in your writing, including capitalization, punctuation, word choice, and more. So these tools don't pretend to be something else. They identify themselves as rewriting tools. For example, Spinbot advertises that its amazing contextually intelligent software will boost your creative momentum as you find unlimited new ways of expressing yourself. One click could be the extra push you need to get your brain out of that writer's slump. Which, don't we all want to have that? The easy button. And by intelligent, it means that it uses algorithms to detect and replace or adjust original words and structure. Another tool, WordTune, tries to understand the context and semantics of what you write and uses multiple language models to rephrase sentences. So these are tools that, on the surface at least, intend to help writers sharpen their writing. Now, I've used Grammarly, and to some extent it did help catch some issues, but I still had to know what made sense or not. But let's see what they do. So, Helen, if you could put the links into the chat, that would be helpful. So Helen's going to put some links into the chat, and these are for 3 tools that I want us to quickly take a look at. I'm also going to give you some text to test out. Let me just highlight, let me just grab that in a second here. I'm just going to stop my share. No, I'm not going to stop my share. I will have to stop my share just briefly and pull some text and put that into the chat. So that's the text I want you to use.
So Claudius, for the benefit of those who watch the recording after today's session,
Yes.
who might not be able to see that, could you maybe give us an indication of what's in the chat?
I will, yes.
Thanks for that.
I'm just going to find my sharing screen here again. There we go. So there we go. So this is text that comes from my own work, and I'll just read it out. Yet another perspective insists that the college did not and would not have undertaken internationalization solely for the money. Evidently, there exist different perspectives from different vantage points. And on the next slide, I'll bring up the full body of the text. So take that text, plunk it into one of those tools. Don't use Grammarly because that's a different thing altogether. And on the next slide, I will ask you to pay attention to what you noticed. So perhaps in the chat, you can let us know when you took that text, plunked it into WordTune, Quillbot, or the other one, what you noticed. Was it the same as what I got, or was it similar? I'll give you a little bit of time to do that. And so this was from a piece of writing that I did, if you're wondering where it came from. Okay, so I see Eiling says, try Quillbot. Another viewpoint maintains that the college did not and would not pursue internationalization purely for financial gain. Clearly, distinct perspectives exist from various vantage points. Additionally, personal conversations with a colleague integrally involved in international activities uncovered a strong desire for a clear, rational, comprehensive international strategy to guide their efforts. Comprehensive strategy was not one that not only acknowledged institutional challenges, but also that sets goals and provided concomitant supports across all facets of the college, which isn't too bad. And someone says Spinbot, so Beatrice says Spinbot results were similar. So Helen says Quillbot changed the words but not the order of ideas. Some of the words actually changed the ideas from the original meaning. And WordTune, yeah, sometimes this might have been, I tried to pick a phrase that would fit within the word constraints for the free versions or the unsubscribed versions of WordTune, but maybe they've changed that. So just looking at the chat, tried Spinbot, took a select few words and changed them synonyms. Gave me different degrees of change with color-coded changes. Yeah, so synonyms that weaken the writing or slightly change meaning. So you can see from my example here on the screen that I've highlighted some of the differences. Now, some of them are minor, some of them are a little bit more substantive. So when I did this, you can see the highlighted vantage focuses, different perspective vantage focuses. That doesn't make sense. So you're getting some similar results to mine. You're also seeing the fact that every time you use these tools, you don't get the same results. So there's some variability. So in the highlights that I've given here, you can see that overall the writing is now, at least in the example that I've got here, the writing is now stilted and lacks coherence. And a typical English writer wouldn't write like this. So as an aside, sometimes this structure results from multiple translations in Google Translate. So for example, paste in English text, translate it to another language, and translate it back to English. And on this next slide, I've done just that. So I took this and put it into Google Translate a couple times and back to English, and you can see that the writing is a little better, but still stilted. So I went from English to Punjabi back to English, and why I use Punjabi is because it's nothing like English. It does not have the same structure, the same formation of same grammatical rules, and many of my students would be translating to and from Punjabi. So different perspectives from different recipe points. I've seen language like this where it just doesn't make sense, and I've often wondered how they arrived at it. So you can see also then that something that could be legitimately being used by a student to help them might also yield similar results to tools that may not be as legitimate, perhaps. But you'll be happy to know that there aren't many of these tools and they're losing popularity. Oh, hold on. Sorry. That's the wrong script. That's for my alt.universe presentation. Sorry about that. So no, it doesn't get better. These tools are many and they are popular and they are marketed heavily, meaning a simple search on proofreading software in Google or paraphrasing software will yield many results that they can choose from. In fact, Forbes, Reuters News, Associated Press, and so on have AI-powered robot reporters that help them thoroughly analyze data and write articles based on that data without human intervention. So we can't ignore these tools. But the fact remains that having a tool doesn't automatically yield better or credible results. For example, giving me a car battery analyzer just allows me to repeat the results or regurgitate what it says. Doesn't allow me to interpret or critique them or even act on what that data from that car battery analyzer says. So there are legitimate purposes, but uneducated use by students doesn't promote or demonstrate learning. And why is this? Well, let's take a look at some examples. So this is from my own example from a student submission, and I had to address rephrasing. A student submitted a paper with the following. So the first paragraph is written by the student. The second paragraph is actually from the article. And the article actually has an error in it, but so just ignore that. So the student said, due to the revolutionization of media technology, the original article said, due to the increased popularity, it should be popularity of it, but popularity of it, that's the error in the original. You can see just a weird word substitution there. The entire paper was like this. I call it plagiarized. So combination of plagiarized and rephrased. And it was obvious to me from the style of writing the lack of coherence. So that's what clued me into the fact that something was wrong. So in preparation for this presentation, I decided to see what Spinbot would do with the same section of text, trying to figure out what was the student doing. So the first example is Spinbotted, and it changes from rephrase to rephrase, and the second is from the article, so it's the same text as before with the error in it. So what Spinbot did was actually a bit worse than what the student submitted, but demonstrates what you can look for. So when you think something's off, here's some ways to see if maybe rephrasing tool was used. So what happened in that situation? Well, the students submitted a paper with substantial portions directly copied and poorly paraphrased, despite significant instruction in research paper writing and the research writing process, and despite the expectation that fundamental skills exist. Now, I don't know if rephrasing software was used, but the effect is the same. So it's important to look at the facts without interpretation. So what is observable? I found that there was copywriting, copying plus writing, so not original writing and not original work. There was regurgitation rather than summary, description, not analysis. So often there will be several issues throughout the work, not necessarily just what I've highlighted here. I had to address the following issues that most of us would likely consider. This is academic misconduct. If yes or no, what process to enact? Is this a teachable moment? Do I make a formal allegation? Do I ignore it and fail the student for a poorly written paper? So for me, remember I said that procedural and substantive fairness and justice is important. So even if it's only to have a defensible decision in case of a dispute. So in this case, the integrity of academic performance was compromised. The paper did not meet the requirements, but also the students' actions were not acceptable. There was frustration on my part and on the student's part. My frustration was with the result, and perhaps with the fact that the student hadn't come to me with their frustrations or problems. For the student, there was likely frustration with feeling lost or feeling inadequate in terms of her writing ability. And of course, then I need to figure out what the penalty should be. But also, beyond that, there was an issue of time for me and for the student. The extra time analyzing and responding to this issue was disruptive to my marking process and took up my time, which I'm not paid for. I'm a contract instructor at the university. Dealing with this at the end of the course resulted in the student having to spend extra time responding and rewriting. And this ties back into my frustration that some students don't talk with me in the first place. At the U of W, and maybe at your own institutions, instructors can only make an allegation of plagiarism. So faculty can't make a determination. That's for, at the U of W, a Senate subcommittee to do. And this results in a particular process that requires me to send in formal documentation, but also removes me from the process until the committee hands down its decision. I could end up having to mark the paper after all if the misconduct allegation is not supported, or the student could be suspended, even if I would have been willing to negotiate a different outcome. If I choose not to make a formal allegation, I can't fail the student based on plagiarism, but I can make it a teachable moment. But is this fair to me and to the other students who have done their own work? Those are just questions we have to deal with. So at the point of observation, I have to make a decision. So for a moment, just looking more generally, Bailey and Withers note that paraphrasing is a key component of writing in college and university. Concomitantly, paraphrasing is a key challenge to students. And they observed in their study that drafting was often just a process of pasting sections of text with some tweaks, and the result was a thoughtless word salad that was hard to decode. Now, they were looking at how students use the grammar tools in Word and coupled with other web-based tools. They found that some students don't make fully efficient use of available tools. So instruction in effective use is necessary, but paraphrasing well does not rely on these tools. So I would extend this to teaching students how to effectively use wordsmithing tools in conjunction with learning how to write without them. We can blame computers all we want, but really human nature and how we interpret feedback play an important role. For students, success is performance. This leads to decisions that be based more on what students think instructors want to see and what they think will get them the marks that they want. For an instructor, success is learning. But this may lead to providing feedback that students don't know or don't have time to learn how to incorporate and unintentionally pushes them to use shortcuts. So giving them feedback that they may interpret as unduly critical and they're not meeting the standard may push them to try to meet the standard that they think the instructor is setting for them, when in fact that's not what we were really trying to get them to do. One of my students explicitly said that he used SpinBot because he and his friends wanted their papers to be sophisticated. I had to disabuse him of the notion that I wanted sophisticated papers. So remember, if a student doesn't know how to write or have the necessary vocabulary, they won't know when a tool is providing gibberish or incorrect words. They will be writing blindly, relying on the tool for accurate wording. So in my situation, my students had never done a research paper before. This was their first experience. They were nervous and tried as best or as much as they could to meet the standard. They couldn't find and didn't ask for guidance on how to summarize and paraphrase. They did the readings and provided examples, but didn't know how to do that other than copy directly. Now, this doesn't fully explain situations where there were lack of citations. However, a lack of their own knowledge led them to use exact words from the articles. So they were using articles that were well above their ability to comprehend. But this also demonstrated a lack of conceptual knowledge of what a research paper is. And this can lead to needless angst. Needless because if they had approached me with their questions, I would have been able to point them down the right path, or would have tried to point them down the right path. So we need to consider this. This is where intentionality may or may not be a factor. We all learn to write like this. We're taught to use synonyms to expand our vocabulary. In school, at least some of us anyway, by selecting similar or alternate words. So I learned how to do that in high school. However, it is a transitional phase. We need to develop our own style of writing and incorporate our vocabulary and synonyms. But for students who haven't been taught how to write or haven't practiced and developed their writing, who don't understand what they're reading, or who just don't have the vocabulary, so for example, EAL students, this is the only way they know how to write with any complexity. It is a sticking point for them. So as you can imagine, patch writing does not require any special apps. It can be done with a thesaurus or dictionary, but it certainly is made easier with built-in tools and word processors and online resources. So what did I do? Well, first, I think it's natural to feel some emotion: anger, disappointment, frustration. Anger because it is real and I'm ticked off about it. Reflective, well, this is both good and bad. So I think, is it my fault? Were the instructions clear? Where could I have explained better or done differently? But getting inquisitive made me question why the student wrote the way they did, which then led me to talk with them. I met with them in Zoom and asked them some general questions to start. So for example, how did this paper come to be? Did you have help with this paper? What kind of help? Then, depending on the particular issues or their responses, I asked more specific questions about particular phrases or sections. And then I explained that what they did could be considered misconduct. If I was satisfied that they rephrased because they didn't have the vocabulary or ability to summarize, I gave a chance to rewrite or graded the assignment on its merits. In a very recent situation, I had a student do an oral version where I could verify their understanding. In another recent example, because it was an early assignment and the student admitted to using rephrasing software and had a reasonable, if not misguided, explanation, I had them rewrite the paper in their own words. They did reasonably well. In serious cases, I would take the allegation of misconduct through the official processes. And I have done that. Now, while some of my students didn't use paraphrasing software, the effect was the same. Again, a marginal reworded paper. In one particular situation, what drove my student to this? Well, her lack of experience and skill with writing, her misunderstanding of what citations really were and how to use them, and her knowledge gap, how to distinguish between work she had read and tertiary sources. Her language skills were also lacking. Google Translate is often used for similar purposes, and some of us have probably relied on it at some point. So what do we do? What is our response? Well, in terms of detecting, either you want to call it misconduct or rephrasing, does the work make sense? Does the tone or sophistication of syntax change throughout the paper? Does the content reflect the object of the assignment? So for example, references to this study intends to, or when in fact the assignment wasn't a study. Right? It looks like, then they're quoting somebody else's work. Specific odd word choices. So for example, understudies instead of students or undergrad students. Now, one caution with this, sometimes these might be artifacts of how your students have learned English. So that's not a definitive thing, it's just something to question. And in detecting, sometimes you have to have students present on and answer questions about their topic, especially in cases where artificial intelligence generated work is not obvious. What about preventing? Well, and I'm talking now about other than willful, intentional usage of these tools. Well, ensure understanding. Check in and ask for demonstration. So either check in understanding about what the assignment is or understanding of what they've written. And can they explain what they've written? When you're explaining what assignments are about, use examples they can understand. Or when explaining what they're supposed to do, make sure you use examples they can understand. So for example, when explaining summarizing, I've used this with a student, and I asked her, I said, well, if I were to ask you about your family, you wouldn't just use quotes from your parents, you would tell me their own story in your own words, or you would tell me their story in your own words. And all of a sudden you could see the light go on in her head. So don't assume students know what you mean. Provide instructions and examples in multiple formats at multiple points along the way. Maybe recast assignments to be iterative where possible. So you catch these issues early on and can provide guidance. It's not always possible though. Keep an open door for students to ask questions during the course, but also give formative feedback on draft submissions. Give useful summative feedback as well. Sometimes the tendency is to mark just to a rubric and check off, the various criteria on the rubric and give that back to the student, but it doesn't give them specific enough feedback on where they went wrong. So that's why I'm advocating for summative and formative written feedback. And examine how we are explaining what writing in an academic setting is. Are we expecting students to make the conceptual shifts themselves? And is that reasonable? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. When we're looking at analyzing what we've seen, record observable facts. Try to avoid drawing conclusions as to motive, etc. initially. Compare the submission with instructions. Is there a reasonable misinterpretation? Are our expectations reasonable given foundational skills and time to learn? So are we expecting too much of students at the level they are at? Is the problem serious enough? So for example, how much has been rephrased, etc., to warrant special attention? Sometimes it's it's not a hill to die on. In terms of responding, think about how we learned to use synonyms in school. And then think about how do we give students the opportunity to experiment with vocabulary and phrasing in our courses. We will have to identify these things early. Intentional assignments, so using intentional assignments or portions of assignments to check students' abilities to paraphrase on their own. When odd phrasing is detected, ask questions first. Dig deep into what the student thought they were doing before accusing them of something. And instead of accusing, enlighten. Let them know what they did was misconduct and reportable. Watch their response. If a student clearly did the reading but had difficulty with the writing, consider options other than reporting. Is compassion warranted? And going forward, what are other ways to check understanding? So you have to be reflective in your own practice. You also have to consider your own time and energy. Do you have it? Consider what is to be gained and by whom. Now, is there another way? Well, two of my colleagues take a natural selection approach. They figure that for early year students, breaches of integrity will catch up with them as they move into more advanced courses. However, while this eases the mental strain on them, this also assumes intentional misconduct. So I don't fully agree with this because in my course, some students are taking it for an easy credit before graduating, so there is not another year for them to get caught, as it were. And I do think I have a responsibility to the profession and to the institution to ensure that student work reflects their learning and that misconduct isn't seen to be rewarded. Also, in the case of unintentional misconduct, we should catch and correct it as early as possible. That seems fair and seems to be what university is about. So clearly such tools are here to stay, and they're becoming a legitimate workplace tool. So what should our responses be as classroom educators, policymakers, or institutions? We can't change the landscape, but we can have a response. And such a response could entail showing students when to use these tools, so for example during proofreading and revising, and what these tools will not do for them. Also, it would be wise to provide a curated list of tools that yield credible results. And that way, we are at least guiding them through the process and not leaving it up to their own designs to figure out stuff on their own. So here are some questions we need to discuss. And I'd like to pose this to you just to spur some discussion. So how do we help students navigate between learning foundational and critical thinking skills associated with writing and using writing tools? Do we teach them, or should we teach them to use the tools intelligently? If so, how? And here's the sticky one. Do our own recruiting and admissions practices as institutions contribute to the problem? So at this point, I'll throw it open for discussion. I will come back with a bit of a close-up at the end, but I will stop my sharing now. I'll leave the questions on here for a bit. And I'll
Can I ask a clarifying question? When you say,
Yes.
do we contribute to the problem, and then you mentioned admissions, could you elaborate a little bit more on what you'd like to reflect on?
Sure. With the attempt to be more inclusive in our institutions, are we bringing in students who are perhaps not as capable or who don't meet our expectations that were set years ago? And then do we provide enough supports for them to be able to ladder up their skills or scaffold their skills? In other words, are we being equitable in how we bring students in, or do we just bring students in and set them up for failure? And I'm thinking of the entire spectrum of students, not just one group of international students or anything like that, but across the spectrum of who we're actively trying to engage in education. Does that help?
It does. Yeah, I'll be interested to see what folks come up with in the chat. Thanks.
Yes. So I'm just looking through the chat now. Labor intensive. I'm just going back. Wow, the chat was exploding. Yes, when I used AI writing tools, I meant artificial intelligence, not academic integrity. I'm just going to go back up here a little bit. Change from here. Some really good comments in the chat, which I'll take up shortly.
With regards to the, oh, okay, go ahead. I have a question for you afterwards.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So Joel says the last question is massive. Yes, and for anybody who is on the front lines of teaching or has been a student, that is a big question. And Sarah, yes, your question.
Yeah, when I look at these questions, one of the things that comes to mind for me is instructor autonomy and agency with the kinds of things that they're encouraged to or permitted to use in their own classrooms, right? In some learning environments, individual instructors have a lot of autonomy, and in others, they'll come in and the school will tell them, this is what you're going to do, and this is how we do it, and don't deviate from the course syllabus. And I could imagine in some workplace environments that even if an instructor wanted to try out these paraphrasing tools and engage students in a learning experience that might use them, that the instructors themselves might face barriers from their employer. That's just kind of an added complexity.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, at the college where I work full time, that is sometimes an issue that comes up. When are we using approved technologies? And that's a reality. And there are ways around. I mean, you can teach around these issues without necessarily you can teach about these tools and the idea of rephrasing. And sometimes you have to approach it creatively from a slightly different angle. I think maybe focusing more on how to take ownership of your rephrasing, how to be confident in what you're doing, how to, as you know, for students especially at the first and second year levels, who may not be as confident in their ability. They don't think they know, but help them build that confidence by giving them assignments where they can practice paraphrasing on their own. So yes, good point. And Karine says, allowing multiple ways they can express their learning. So I had an assignment where it was kind of an awkward assignment. I didn't set the assignments, so I had to use these particular suite of assignments in the course I teach. And it was a goal-setting assignment where we were asking students to set goals across 3 domains of life: personal, academic, and professional. For some of the students, it was easy enough to do, but for a lot of the students, it was difficult. They couldn't think outside of academia. And for some of them, they couldn't write it out because we were looking at SMART goal setting. So I said, okay, listen, you know what? I'm getting tired of reading poorly written essays. So the last couple times I did the assignment, I said, just do an infographic. Show me that you know what goal setting is about. Set some goals in these domains. And then the second half of the assignment, so they got part marks for that. And then I had a one-on-one interview with them and asked them questions where I saw that there were gaps in what their explanations or their examples. I'd ask them to explain. And in some cases, their marks went way up because what they couldn't express in writing, they could express verbally. So yes. And then Deborah, let's see. Digital competencies and skills express students using tools to help enhance, not replace communication skills need to be taught as well. Students will be using Grammarly and Word in the workplace and other writing tools, so approved technologies need to be part of the pedagogy. Even while writing this, red squiggly line came up for spell check. So I'm still a student, but I was doing an online exam, which I despise doing online exams, but regardless. And we weren't allowed to use, anything other than a certain set of resources. However, I had Grammarly installed into my browser, and it would catch spelling mistakes. I mean, that was all, or grammatical mistakes. Not that we were being marked on that, but I halfway through the exam, I realized, wait a minute, is that going to be flagged as misconduct? That was never addressed, right? So I use it as part of my work. But I'm also a student, so is it permitted? And think about how do we, in courses and programs that are more geared to journalism and communications and workplace writing, if students are going into a workplace where they're expected to be able to manipulate the tools, not necessarily, in addition to come up and be creative, are we preparing them for that reality? Yeah, so just some other things that I'm looking at. So Eileen Reist says, so thanks, I'm glad this was reflective and enlightening. Yes, showing students the challenges of rephrasing software. Now, I don't know that I have come up with an answer for myself. I'm always hesitant to show students tools that they may not have come up with on their own and thereby put them on a path that they wouldn't have gone on naturally. I know that some colleagues from other institutions I know there's one colleague from Mount Royal who she and I have talked about that. And so I know she's experimenting with showing students some of these tools. But yes, that's everyone will have to make their decisions on that. And there are disciplinary differences, as Jennifer points out. Maybe Jennifer, if you want to elaborate on those disciplinary differences in the chat, that would be useful. And Deborah, the approach needs to be perhaps more than just learning to write, but learning how writing in a language works. Yes, and the contextual value or the context of words in sequence. I mean, students are, on one hand, some students are trying to cheat the system. I mean, I've experienced that. I'm sure many others have. But in other, I'll be generous and say that the bulk of situations, students are trying to survive and figure things out on their own, which we tell them, we encourage them, take ownership of your learning, and perhaps we need to find out how to be better partners with them in learning, and also knowing that that takes an emotional toll on us. And I think the emotional toll, the emotional labor that goes into this is a concern. And I think Jennifer brought that up, labor-intensive nature of what we do. And I should point out, my course is not a writing course, although I focus on certain aspects of writing, but there are other writing courses at the university that students can take. And they're tailored to certain disciplines. But if a student is not performing well in my course, I have to give them at least some guidance on their writing. Any other thoughts? I see some more messages popping up. So Deborah, let's see here. Sarah points to Sylvia Rossi, yes. And I've actually incorporated a lecture from Sylvia in my course starting this term, because I realize that students aren't as up on that as they should be, and Sylvia was far better qualified to deal with it than I am.
And maybe just for the benefit of those watching the recording later on, we're talking about Sylvia Rossi from Mount Royal University. So just to clarify that for folks later on.
Yeah, and she's coming out with a book that I think Sarah is editing. Yes. Sarah.
Yeah, Sylvia has a chapter in our upcoming book, Academic Integrity in Canada. And Sylvia's chapter is specifically on paraphrasing. And I know that you two have been in touch, and for me, it's really exciting to see colleagues from across different Canadian universities and institutions talking about this, collaborating, discussing, and engaging in active dialoguing. And interestingly, you both have a similar stance on focusing on student success and learning first, which I think is totally exciting.
Yes. Yeah. I think a couple people in the chat highlighted the enlighten rather than punish, or instead of accusing, ask questions. That is, I found that to be, I think about it, how would I like to be treated? And I flip that around and say, okay, well then I will treat my students that way. So perhaps I sometimes end up being a bit more compassionate than other instructors might see as reasonable, but it's also a mental health self-care issue for me that I have put students through the academic misconduct process, and in some cases it was more frustrating for me than it was for them. So I'm willing to do it, but only when it's absolutely warranted. And then it's hit and miss as to what sort of instruction and support students get in developing their writing. And that's at all levels. It's not just at the post-secondary level, it's before that. And it's also different cultures of learning and that value certain types of writing or writing at all. I've asked some of my students what their writing experience was in their home countries, and they said, well, we haven't had to do much because we had the chance to choose whether we took something that was writing intensive or not. And they chose not to. And then they took my course, which was a bit of a challenge for them.
I'll chime in here, and Claudia, I recall working with a master's level student, MA student, who came to the University of Calgary a few years ago, and we were doing this course. It was an intro course for all our master's students, and he disclosed to me that they had never written a paper in their home country. Never. They had only done exams. And so writing anything was brand new. I thought, holy smokes, you're at the master's level. So there was a lot of, referring the student to the Student Success Center and saying, we have writing workshops, we have supports, you're not alone, we're here to help you. But the student was basically terrified because it was coming to a very different environment than what they'd grown up with.
Absolutely. And I, as you said that, I remembered a classmate of mine when I was doing my master's who actually was working in post-secondary, and as I'll say guidance person. I'm not sure exactly what his role was, but the quality of writing was puzzling. I'll put it that way, because I think English might have been a second language, but I also think that they were not used to writing in a strictly academic format. And to compound matters, based on the consistency of errors and the type of errors, I think they were using a keyboard that had syllabics on it, and it was sort of translating it. No, not translating it, but it was confusing the issue, compounding any errors they were making. And I've also had another master's student that I had to collaborate with after I went through, I think the drafts we submitted, or she submitted, I went through, I think, 20 revisions of it before it was remotely coherent. And that was at the master's level and not just beginning at the master's level. So, and she was getting A's in the course, by the way. So, yes. I'm just looking at the chat here. Hit miss. So Jennifer put some references on paraphrasing from Keck 2010. Generic writing support is insufficient. My course is geared to, and so what I see is I'm a social sciences, humanities. That's where my course is, who my course is geared to. A lot of my students are coming from business and sciences, and I'm not a sciences person. I can write in the business side isn't hard for me, but the sciences piece, it's a different style of writing. And so I think that we need to consider that as well. But some students will take these courses to expand their writing ability, so because they know what they're heading into. Sandra, we've simplified our process of reporting so it's easier for the instructor and the learner. I'm assuming this is in terms of academic misconduct. We try to cut down on bureaucracy. Reporting doesn't always mean penalties, but it always means support for the student. Yeah, that's good. So, and Joel, I'm curious if you have thoughts on the services and their relation to plagiarism detection services. Well, perhaps. Turnitin is not young. Turnitin is like 20 years old, if I'm right. So I think there's always a cause and effect. There's always a reaction to things. So I think there's probably some. I don't have any concrete evidence to support that, nor do I know if that's possible to get concrete evidence. But some of the research that I've read, does bring the plagiarism detection services, and they sort of juxtapose these two camps, and they say that, and I don't have a name offhand, but they did say that these plagiarism, the rephrasing apps, are being used to try to thwart plagiarism detection software. And I think that it's to rely strictly on plagiarism detection software is perhaps introduces some issues in and of itself. I'm always curious as to when I submit stuff to a plagiarism detection, like Turnitin, what it sees as potential plagiarism. It's kind of interesting. So yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Lauren. And thanks, Joel, for the question. So Karen, it's hard to prove because the results are never the same. So one of the strategies I've used when students decline to admit what they've used, I keep the conversation going with them and ask them to explain how they arrived at something, or can you explain what this means? Where did you get this? And I explain to them, at some point I do explain why I'm picking on those particular sentences. And in one case, where it wasn't plagiarism or rephrasing software used, where it was informal contract cheating, the student finally had to admit that they'd copied from somebody else. And it was just being diligent and respectful in how you ask the questions. And sometimes you just have to take the student at their word. And again, is this a hill you're going to die on? And I never challenge my students I never ever pose this, I can detect your plagiarism. Like, I never try to set up that dynamic, because A, I can't. And B, I don't think it's right to challenge students to do something that's wrong. And say, I'm going to detect this. I can detect it. I've got these secret methods. I don't bother telling them how I do things. Okay. I don't know. I don't have a sense of what the timing is, where we are with the time. But any other questions or comments? Jennifer, yeah. Students about the language choices and paraphrasing. Why and how did you rephrase this? Exactly. If they can explain their decisions, it means they've thought about it. Now, they still may end up, I've had a student where she was able to explain what she was writing, but it didn't come out that way in writing. And she said, well, I didn't know how to explain it, perfectly in writing. But she was able to explain it verbally. And so I took that into consideration, and I just gave her a caution. Right? So there was no penalty. It was just, well, okay, what happens when you do that? Just put down your thoughts in writing. I'd rather see your imperfect writing than the perfect writing of somebody else. So giving them a safe place, I use that term advisedly, a safe place in which they can experiment and fail without it being a failure, if that makes sense. Excellent. So just before I conclude, I just wanted to bring this up. And yes, this is a bit goofy, and I can't hear you laughing or groaning, but that's sometimes the way my brain works. But thank you for your participation, and I hope this presentation was worthwhile and that you were able to use something from it. So maybe in the chat, as we sort of close off, list one or two things that you learned, and maybe something that would be worth further exploration or investigation, or something that you hadn't thought of before. And just a list of some of the articles and resources that either I used in coming up with this, or that I found useful in talking about this. And I think the Faltenek article, Detecting Machine Obfuscated Plagiarism, would be useful for you to look at, Joel. And the Rogerson one might be, well, I think they're all useful. The Wall one, Identifying Machine Paraphrase Plagiarism, I think they talk about plagiarism detection software as well, but I could be wrong about that one. But some useful, and by no means a comprehensive list of the resources.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Claudius, for your presentation today. And on behalf of the Taylor Institute and on behalf of our webinar series, just let me express my gratitude for how grateful we are for you and for your presentation, for sharing your insights and wisdom, and practice-informed as well as research-informed strategies to navigate some of these complexities. So I will invite those who are with us present today to share your love for the presentation in the chat, either with an emoji or with some kind words for Claudius. And I also mentioned in the chat that our next webinar coming up is on March 25th. It'll be with Dr. John Paul Fox from Ryerson University in Toronto, and he'll be here to talk to us specifically about visual plagiarism. In other words, plagiarism in non-text-based disciplines, including fashion, graphic arts, architecture, etc. And so I invite you to register for that one to join us. Claudius, again, thank you so much for joining us today. It was an honor to have you.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Have a good rest of the day.